Let's follow through with the conversation. We on the line to Dr. Kate Orkin, who's a senior research fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. A very good evening to you. Welcome. Let's first start by asking you to please explain what can we learn from other developing countries dealing with COVID-19, the crisis itself, and at this point on whether to choose lives or livelihoods or how to create that balance.
So I think South Africa has been doing really well and have been commended by the WHO for their health response, but also been commended by economists around the world for the way that they've undertaken their social protection and economic response. So I think we can really, we're in many places we're being featured as some of the leaders, and we can be really proud of that. I think some of the things we've done on the economic side that have been really good is balancing the social protection response, so getting money out through the grant system with doing things for the real economy, and in particular trying to preserve existing jobs. So we've done a really good job at balancing a range of different concerns and trying also to see how the situation is evolving over time.
Just looking at what other countries have achieved, especially as we had an announcement by our president earlier on what is of urgent need in getting the economy going again, for instance. I want to talk about whether or not is there a time and place when you can say the country can actually manage a lifting of regulations based on, the societal dynamics, the socioeconomic dynamics.
So I think, when people have been talking about how big does the economic response need to be, I think what's been amazing about the national response in South Africa is how much it's been guided by science. So, we've been talking about, the economy is going to contract by 10%. We need to put in 10% of spending to make up for it. It doesn't really work like that. It's about spending smart. And what's been terrific about some of the parts of the government response to date is the spending they've chosen is things where the spending has kind of multiplicative benefits. So you're getting more money out actually than what you're putting in. There are two kinds of responses that have been like that. The first is the sort of job retention schemes. So obviously it's really difficult to get those working properly, and it hasn't been perfect to date. But it's a really good idea because it preserves existing links between firms and workers that are productive. The workers are productive in their particular firms, and that's a good thing to try and keep going as much as possible. So you're actually getting more out of that money than if you were just paying it through unemployment insurance. Similarly, we know that cash grants can actually be a stimulus to the economy, and that's why governments around the world, so in much of Latin America, in India and Pakistan, many different places have chosen to do cash grants because they don't only benefit the people who get the money, they actually have benefits by putting income flowing through the whole economy.
I want to talk about the conundrum of the raft of measures the president announced and that government itself has been expanding on with regards to the social measures that they've put in place. Some have said you continue to create dependency and creating space for even greater dependency, and others are saying, I mean, it's just a simple human logic that there's huge inequality and you have to work at lifting people up from this crisis.
So I'm a scientist. There is some science in economics. So, in macroeconomics, a lot is quite uncertain. But in microeconomics, a lot of the work that is done is actually based on clinical trials. So it's not of clinical interventions, but it's testing social interventions. And there we can be quite precise about our evidence base. And one of the things we know the most about is cash transfers, because hundreds of governments around the world have done them in the last 20 years. And there's really very little evidence that cash transfers increase dependency on the state. So they don't decrease whether people work. In some studies, they actually increase job search because they give people money for transport costs and airtime. It's not going to be sufficient to increase employment if there aren't jobs there, but it certainly can help people to find jobs. In the current situation, it stops people from selling their productive assets when they face a shock. So that often happens. People have to sell a cow or a phone or a vehicle, or they go into their savings and then they can't look for work when the crisis ends. And so cash transfers stop people from having to make those asset sales. And the biggest thing we have really strong evidence of is that people spend a lot of cash transfers on food. We know that children with poor nutrition don't grow up properly. They have worse cognitive development. They have worse health. They have worse schooling outcomes. They have worse earnings their whole lives. And we have really strong scientific evidence of this. We also know that cash transfers prevent some of those negative impacts. It's harder to find a smarter investment in our country's future than what the president did earlier this week.
So, food security being one of the major issues being considered, I want to talk about the existing child support grants and getting more cash into the homes. How do you create a safety net and programs to help the poor that is sustainable? People are getting a leg up. We can't exactly dictate to them how to use it, but it's obvious the needs are patently clear what they need it for. But it's also to get people out of the poverty trap.
So, the first thing that we've done right is we've stopped people from having to make those absolutely desperate decisions that can set them back for many years, the poverty traps, as you've said. So already, if you give people, you say the money is coming, people can sometimes call on buffer savings or relatives just to get them to the point at which they can get the grant. So we've already done something. We've stopped people from making those shock asset sales. But there's been some really interesting evidence coming up recently that actually cash transfers do stimulate growth. So Keynes, in the 1930s made these arguments, but we've now got randomized trials from Kenya where they tested the effects of putting cash transfers into the economy. And they find that in an economy where there's a lot of slack, so there's a lot of surplus labor like our economy, but it's quite an open market, there's a lot of trade going on. If you put a cash transfer in, it actually can stimulate demand. So even people who don't get the cash transfer, their wages go up, the increase in revenues in their businesses, and there's an increase in economic growth. And they found a multiplier of 2.6. So for every $1 that went into fiscal stimulus, that helped to grow the local economy by $2.6.
All right, Dr.
So,
Kate,
we can actually have some positive effects on stimulating the economy.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts with us. Dr. Kate Orkin, Senior Research Fellow at Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford.